Hello everyone, it's me, Marianne Taylor, the house detective. I researched the history of houses all over Australia, and here are my top 5 most recent interesting, quirky and cool finds. Firstly, what Australian business has run for 105 years in the same building? Why does this job no longer exist? What was Norman Park called before it was Norman Park? Why do these windows make this building so special? And can I convince you to love six-pack flats? Stick around to find out. The history of Norman Park. So in last episode, I chatted about the history of East Brisbane, and it is sort of bordered on the, I always have to picture this in my head, the eastern side by Norman Creek. So what about the history of the next suburb across on the other side of Norman Creek? Well, that of course is Norman Park. And this area was slow to develop because initially there was no bridge across the creek. So development sort of ended at the creek and was very, very slow on the other side. And it wasn't until a bridge was actually built now I couldn't work out the exact date of this, so if any of you know, please let me know in the comments below. It was either the end of 1858 or the very start of 1859. A bridge was built over the creek, which allowed traffic then to cross over and keep on going, and this then became the main route out to Cleveland, out to the Bayside. So it was known as New Cleveland Road, eventually just Cleveland Road. And then later, it was renamed Wynnum Road. And the original route out to Cleveland, which was further south, it became known as, not surprisingly, Old Cleveland Road. So that's how Old Cleveland Road got its name, which it retains today. Now, a number of accounts of the history of Norman Park state that both the creek and the suburb were named after a governor of Queensland, General Sir Henry Wiley Norman. Now, this is absolutely not true, and I'll tell you why that is. He wasn't governor until 1889, and Norman Creek was shown with that name on a map from as early as 1825. Originally it was called Norman's Creek, now Norman Creek. So it was shown on a map from 1825, so we know it was named by that date. Sir Henry Norman wasn't even born then, so it cannot have been named after him. Now, it's also very unlikely that the suburb was named after him because the suburb gets its name from one of the earliest residential divisions in that area, the Norman Park Estate. And this was subdivided and sold from 1887 before he became governor of Queensland. And I don't think that he would have been well known enough for them to name an estate after him before he became governor. So it's more likely that Norman Park Estate was named after the creek, which had already been named by 1825. As to the original source of that Norman, no one seems to know. It seems to be a little bit of a mystery. Before the Norman Park Estate was subdivided, the whole general area was known as Galloway's Hill. Now, this name was also the name of a local landmark, an actual hill that was called Galloway's Hill, and then the surrounding area around it became known by that name. Now, the peak of this hill is just to the east of where Lord's Hill College is now. So just on the eastern side of Hawthorn Road opposite the college is approximately where the peak of the hill was, and there was a surveying point on top of this peak, which is shown on a number of maps, which is how I know that. Now, it was named for John James Galloway. Now, he owned so much land in this area. He owned acres and acres and acres around this area, and that's why the hill gained his name and why the area was named after him as well. And some people, it actually became a suburb of Brisbane or a locality, and some of you may actually even remember the area being called that because it was in use up until quite recently. Interestingly, a little bit of a side tangent, another huge landowner in the area, he wasn't huge, he owned a large area He owned a huge amount of land in the area. Although he did help pioneer the commercial sugar industry in Queensland, so maybe he was a big guy, I don't know. So Louis Hope, he was the other guy who owned a ton of land in this district, and if that name's familiar to you, it might be because he was the one who built Ormiston House at Cleveland. So quite a well-known historic home and well worth a visit if you haven't been there. It's open to the public, it's a museum, and it's a fantastic and beautiful place to visit. So there's a connection again to Cleveland. Before the Norman Park estate was subdivided and sold, so when it was known as roughly as Galloway's Hill, it was mainly used for farming, and there was very few houses in the district. It was very sparsely populated, and there's some great old drawings and maps and things that show just how undeveloped the area was. It was actually a really popular spot for picnics, so people would travel there on their horse and cart or by horse or however else they travelled around, boat, and would have lovely picnics in this beautiful scenic area that was still largely covered with bush. Impossible to imagine now, and I love some of these old photos that show what is now Wynnum Road and how completely unspoilt the area is, and just it's absolutely remarkable. A huge area of 200 acres in this location, which was still completely covered with bush, was purchased by the Queensland Deposit Bank and Building Society in the mid-1880s, and they set about clearing all the trees, which makes me cringe to think about it. It would have been like old growth forests and that type of thing. But they cleared the whole site and they subdivided it and created the Norman Park estate. So they were the ones that actually named this estate. The first sale of land in the Norman Park estate was held in March 1887, and then they continued to subdivide, clear and sell other sections within the state over the next, I think it was like 30 or so decades. The railway to Cleveland arrived in 1889 through this area, and this was normally a big boost to a local district because it was very attractive to live somewhere where you could catch public transport to and from work in the city. However, this boom after the railway arrived was sort of short-lived because in the 1890s there was a series of floods of the Brisbane River, and 1893 in particular was a really bad one, and that inundated a lot of the low-lying areas of Norman Park. And of course, the flooding of the creek made it really hard to access the new suburbs. So that sort of stalled sales a little bit. Despite the flooding though, sales of the Norman Park estate continued slowly over the next 2 or 3 decades, and other estates as well were subdivided around this one. In the East Brisbane episode, I talked about Stanley Bridge Estate, and that was another nearby estate to this one. Eventually, the entire area took on the name of Norman Park. So there you go. That was a really quick, very jumbled history of Norman Park. A lost occupation or job. Now, of course, there's quite a few of these jobs that were once very, very common but are no longer around anymore. My dad, for example, used to be a printer's compositor, where he would assemble all the text blocks and other things into a big frame for printing newspapers or printing on documents. Obviously, that job no longer exists anymore with digital printing. It's all done on a computer. As I mentioned, I researched a house at East Brisbane recently, and I talked a little bit more about that in the last episode, episode 29. Well, as part of researching that house, I found one of the residents that lived there, Mortimer Marshall Wolfgram. Isn't that an awesome name? Sounds so impressive. Well, his occupation on the electoral rolls was listed as ice vendor. So before electric refrigeration and freezers, people had what were called an ice box or an ice chest. This was basically a piece of furniture, often made of timber, and it had a waterproof container on top, normally lined with metal, sometimes zinc or lead, and underneath was a storage compartment. Now, in that top waterproof box, a block of ice would be placed. and that then would keep the food below in the storage area cool. So it was like basically a bit like an esky really, but the ice was kept separate from the food. But people couldn't produce their own ice. So ice was produced in what were called ice works, and there was one of these at Woolloongabba and there was also one at South Brisbane. So I suspect that Mortimer probably worked for one of those factories. And what would happen is an ice vendor like Mortimer would travel around with the horse and cart with the big blocks of ice on the back, and he would deliver them to houses. So he would take the ice block off the back of the horse and cart and he would bring it inside and he would plonk it in the ice box. And these delivery people were known as ice vendors or the Iceman. No, not that Iceman. Although I'm pretty sure that the housewives wouldn't have minded if their Iceman looked like Val Kilmer. Many years ago, I was hired by a gentleman in Melbourne to research his house at Kew East. And then a few years later in 2020, he got back in touch with me because he wanted to research a building that was in Melbourne CBD, and it had been built by a member of his family and it was still in the family. So he wanted to know a little bit more about it and he had specific questions that he wanted answered. So he hired me to have a look into it. And I am so glad he did because firstly, I knew basically nothing about Melbourne history and very little about its architectural history. So I learnt heaps there. And secondly, it was absolutely fascinating. The family, so the Michaels family built this building and it's called the Michaels Building. And the story of the business that they ran out of it for over 105 years was absolutely intriguing as well. The Michaels Building is on the corner of Lonsdale and Elizabeth Streets, and if you know Melbourne or you've been down there or you live there, you may recognise this building. So the gentleman who hired me, it was his great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Michaels, who had built this building. And construction began in 1915. He purchased the land on the 26th of July 1915, and then I think construction must have begun quite soon afterwards because it was completed by 1916 and they opened their business then. Now, he was a jeweller, Emmanuel, but he actually opened a gun and pawn shop in this building. That's PAWN, not the other alternative, although that might have been slightly more lucrative. So he opened a business there, and then his son, Harold Isaac, subsequently established a chemist shop there. And this chemist shop ran for decades. So he established it in 1925. If you're my age or older, you will recall that you used to be able to get your camera films developed at chemists. Now, I'm cringing as I'm saying this, but I do realise that there are probably people watching this who don't remember film cameras, so I'm going to quickly explain this. Isn't that terrifying? So before we had digital cameras, you had cameras that needed to have a roll of film loaded into them, and you would open the back of the camera, put the film in, you would wind it on, close the back, and then the image would be captured onto the film as a negative, and you had to take that somewhere that could develop that and produce prints from the negative. Now, because this involved a lot of chemicals, it was often done in pharmacies or chemist shops. So that became a big side business for a lot of these places, and they also began to sell film, obviously, and also sell cameras. That's exactly what Michael's Chemist did. They started to develop film, and they also started to sell film and also sell cameras. By 1976, 80% of the income of this business was coming from the photographic and camera side of things. So they actually decided to go in that direction, and the chemist side of the business was sort of closed, and then they just decided to focus on cameras and film sales and developing. So If you do know this building, you will probably remember it as Michael's camera shop. So they were there for many more decades. By the 2000s, the fourth generation of the Michaels family was running this camera shop, which is just absolutely incredible. Sadly, the camera shop finally closed in 2021 after 105 years of the business in that same location, which is just mind-blowing. I don't think there would be many other businesses that have operated that long and have stayed in the same location. By the time the business closed, they had amassed such a huge collection of cameras and related equipment over those 105 years that it was a veritable museum of photography. And it was only just shortly after the shop closed that they actually auctioned off this collection. And the guy who I was researching the building for actually sent me the auction catalogues, and it is such an amazing range of camera equipment, like just going all the way back to the glass slide, early cameras, the big timber boxes, all the way up to modern camera gear. And it's such... I really wish that it could have gone to a museum. I don't know what actually ended up happening to them, but it is such an incredible collection. And in the auction catalogues, they actually say that it was thought to be the biggest collection of photographic equipment in the Southern Hemisphere. So absolutely remarkable. And I actually quite like old cameras. My husband's a photographer and also collects vintage cameras, so I have a bit of a love of those to start with, but looking through the catalogues was just absolutely beautiful. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. That's why I was so thankful that this person hired me to research this building, because the building's amazing, the business is incredible, and the family is absolutely fascinating. So yeah, thanks for hiring me. So you thought that was the full story of the Michaels building, didn't you? But wait, there's more. As a follow-up to that story, so as I mentioned, I was hired to answer a few specific questions about the building, and it was only hourly work, so I didn't go into a whole heap of detail. In 2024, the chap who had hired me got back in touch because he had discovered this article saying that an architect, Arthur Purnell, had designed the Michaels building, and that some of his records were held at the University of Melbourne. So he hadn't had any luck finding these records, and he wanted to hire me again to see if we could try and track them down. He was particularly hoping that we could find some original plans for the building. So he had completely got me hooked by this point as well. So of course I said, heck yes, I'll definitely help you do some more research. Anyway, long story slightly shorter. I got in touch with the university and I discovered that there was actually an Arthur Purnell expert at the uni, and his name was Dr. Durham Groves. Well, talk about hitting the jackpot. I emailed Dr. Groves, and not only did he reply and share 2 of his books he had written on this architect, but he also had a 1917 article about Purnell and his role in designing this building and about the construction of this building. Even better, there was a photo of Michael's building from 1917. So this is 2 years after construction started on the building and about a year after it was opened. So that was so exciting to find that, and I was so glad I reached out and got in touch with Dr. Groves. Thank you, Dr. Groves. Now, the article highlighted something that I hadn't realised and I hadn't come across yet in my research, and that was that Purnell had used a really innovative form of construction for this building. So it is actually built from reinforced concrete over a frame of steel. Now, for 1915-16, this is absolutely remarkable. So reinforced concrete and steel frames did not become widespread until after the Second World War in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So this is such an early example. Another, just side tangent, another business that was an early adopter of reinforced concrete buildings was actually Queensland Rail. They used them quite early, and they used concrete for a lot of their bridges quite early as well. Anyway, side tangent. Maybe need to do another episode on that because I do love my concrete. But anyway, this was a really innovative technique for the time, and this explains why such an early building had so many windows. It had big banks of windows without any big thick columns in between to support them. Because the building was built from reinforced concrete and had the steel frame, it was strong enough to support these massive walls with big banks of windows in them, unlike earlier construction methods where they needed lots of support in between windows to basically hold the building up. So this building just became even more remarkable because of the construction technique and materials that were used. And I never would have known any of this if we hadn't got in touch with Dr. Groves and found that article and learnt a little bit more about Arthur Pennell. But, okay, so that was all really cool already, right? But the icing on the cake was that Dr. Groves sent through a copy of one of the original plans for the Michaels building. That's right. There's a collection of original plans for Michaels building in the Pennell collection at the University of Melbourne, and he sent one through to us showing some elevations. So as you can imagine, I was so excited, and I quickly sent off an email to the guy that had hired me saying, jackpot, look at this, check it out. So that was just absolutely fantastic. And apparently there are even more plans in the collection, as I mentioned, and we're in the process of trying to view those so we can find out what else there is. But absolutely beautiful plan as well. I love these hand-drawn old plans. They're just absolutely gorgeous. Arthur Pennell was actually quite remarkable, and he designed some incredible buildings in Australia and in Asia as well, but I won't get into detail here. He actually probably needs his whole own episode, but I will put some links in the description if you want to learn more about him and his buildings. I thought you would all enjoy hearing that part 2 of the Michaels building story. 6-pack flats. Now, if you follow my social media, and if you don't, then you should, because it's awesome. You might have seen that I had an article on 6-pack flats published in Agenda magazine, which is the magazine published by the Planning Institute of Australia, Queensland Northern Territory branch. But before I get into this topic any further, I better explain what a 6-pack block of flats is if you're not familiar with that term. Sometimes they're also called walk-ups in the southern states, but basically what they are is this generic, it's basically a generic term for this type of apartment building that was really popular after the Second World War, and you will recognise these. They are everywhere across Australia. They were generally basically big rectangular blocks. They represented a complete change to what had previously been built in Brisbane. They were usually built of brick, and many of them were built in orange brick, and they were quite austere from the outside, quite plain. They were often a set of 6 units, which is I think where the 6-pack mainly comes from. Either that or the tenants really enjoyed drinking beers, I don't know. Or they were really ripped and they had great abdominals, I don't know. But probably more likely it came from the fact that there was often 6 units in these complexes. Now, a lot of people hated them, a lot of people loved them, and basically in this article I discussed why they're important in our architectural history, and how they effectively were shaped by different town planning legislation, and also how they shaped town planning legislation as well. So I just thought that I would share some of the stuff I talked about in the article here, but I'll also put a link to the full article in the description below if you're interested in reading that. But let's take a step even further back first. So purpose-built apartment complexes were almost unheard of in Brisbane until the 1930s. You did have flats or apartments prior to that, but they tended to be parts of an old house. So that a big old house would be split into multiple units. And the other thing was that it was not really considered socially acceptable for people to live in flats. It was sort of a little bit frowned on, and it was basically only single gentlemen who really lived in units. For a single woman to live in a unit was sort of considered very disreputable. Of course, some women would have lived in units, and for families, it just wasn't even a consideration. So at the time, the vision of home for most people in Brisbane was a timber and tin house on its own block with a big backyard. Now, in the 1930s, and particularly after the Second World War, when there was a massive shortage of housing in Australia, unit accommodation became much more common and became much more acceptable for people to live in. The early days of purpose-built unit blocks saw a lot of very beautiful Spanish Mission, Art Deco, very almost boutique style apartment complexes. In the post-war period, it was much more utilitarian in style, as was our housing stock. So there was limits on building materials and labour, and so styles in general were stripped back with much less decoration, and these flats definitely demonstrate that. So as I mentioned, they were usually brick construction, which in Brisbane was, brick houses were reserved for the absolute wealthy because bricks were so expensive. So brick construction in general was very unusual. The other thing that was slightly different with these 6-pack apartment blocks too was that the early purpose-built unit complexes were mainly built in the inner city areas in close proximity to the CBD. So Spring Hill, New Farm, Fortitude Valley, those South Brisbane, those kinds of areas, the sort of more dense inner city areas. Whereas by the time these 6-pack buildings are being constructed, they are being built much further out. They're also being built in existing streets that have old Queenslander houses, single dwellings on individual blocks. And that is part of why people really, really began to dislike them. People thought they looked like alien spacecraft that had landed on these beautiful old character streets. Now, if this is ringing a bell, it's because nothing has changed. People still don't like these big new apartment complexes being dumped in the middle of traditional suburbs that have always been single story with individual dwellings. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. And of course, the appearance of them, people did not like how they looked. They thought they were really ugly and unattractive, and some of us feel that way about new apartment buildings being built now as well. But then there was these demographic of people. There was a lot of post-war immigration from Europe. People from Europe were used to living in apartments. They thought it was absolutely normal. They didn't have a problem with these apartments. The other side of things was that not everyone could afford a beautiful house on a big allotment of land. So these units offered an affordable housing alternative to thousands of people. So these 6-pack flats offered a really smart solution in a rapidly urbanising Brisbane. They were cost effective to build, they were self-contained, they were low maintenance, and they also crucially offered all the mod cons. Now, when they were being built in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of houses in Brisbane that still weren't connected to sewerage. They still had outdoor dunnies in the backyard. These places had indoor hot and cold plumbed water, indoor toilets. They had, a lot of them came with fridges, and a lot of them had garages. And in fact, the Brisbane City Council planning legislation changed over the years to actually eventually mandate that they had to have garages to reduce people parking on the streets. So these units were, although not everyone's cup of tea, they offered this incredible alternative that was so different to what had previously been in Brisbane. And as I mentioned, they were also a lot more affordable for a lot of people. The key benefit in terms of the housing crisis though, and again, this will sound familiar to a lot of you at the moment, the key advantage of these unit blocks was that they could be built on an existing suburban street in amongst the houses, and instead of accommodating one family in one house on that one block, they could accommodate so many more people. So there would be at least 6 units, and so at least 6 families or couples or whatever could be accommodated on the same piece of land that previously would only accommodate one family. So they were a much more dense and efficient use of space, and that was hugely important with the population boom that came after the Second World War. It's hard to imagine now, and not everyone felt this way at the time either, but the stripped back plain style of these buildings and the simple lines were actually quite fashionable. So the modernist movement was really popular at this time, and it was all about minimalism. So no decoration, sleek lines, very, very, very basic, almost utilitarian structures. And brick itself was incredibly fashionable and incredibly modern at this time. Yes, even that orange brick that we've probably all come to dislike a little bit. So they were also quite fashionable, and just like today, some people liked really modern fashionable things, some people didn't. So it was, you know, there was quite a debate ongoing about these new buildings when they were first introduced. As I mentioned, purpose-built flat complexes had been around since the 1930s in Brisbane. To be honest, most of these were more upmarket boutique examples, and they were often quite expensive to live in. So in the post-war period, you had this massive spectrum of different flat buildings. You had the really, really old homes that had been split into multiple flats. You had the really high-end boutique examples, some of those Spanish Mission and Art Deco ones from the 1930s and 40s. You also had places now like Torbreck, which were a post-war apartment complex in Brisbane. Amazing. I would love to live in Torbreck one day. And that sort of was the very upper end, expensive end of the flat spectrum in Brisbane. These 6-pack flat complexes offered a middle ground between affordability and aspiration. So if you couldn't afford to live in those grand, beautiful examples like Torbreck and the others, you could still live in flats, but they were much more affordable. One of the features of these 6-pack flats that many of you will recognize is that they often had romantic names, and they were often written in cursive or really cool fonts on the front of the building or on the fence. And I would love to do a photographic study of those names and fonts because they are just so gorgeous. And I think this was kind of part of the way that they tried to make them feel a little bit more homely, maybe. You know, just like people used to name their houses, they would give these unit blocks a name as well. In addition to their important place in Brisbane's architectural history, the other thing I love about these old flats is that they are generally much bigger than modern flats, much better constructed and much better ventilated. So by only having 6 units in the complex, every single unit had external walls, so there was plenty of natural light through lots of windows, and there was also generally lots of really good cross ventilation. So from a livability perspective, they are actually quite incredible. And I've seen a couple of articles now from, I think it was Melbourne and Sydney, where they're discussing the rise in popularity of these old 6-pack flat complexes for exactly those reasons. So people are buying them and renovating them because they are so much more livable than modern apartments. So there you go, 6-pack flats. And a massively important part of Brisbane's architectural history. Have I convinced you? Yes or no? Comment below. I know a lot of you have very strong feelings about these buildings. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so let loose in the comments. Well, that was episode 30 of the Detective Diaries. I hope you've enjoyed learning about that very mixed bag of topics today. Let me know in the comments your thoughts, any reminiscences. Do you remember the Iceman? Do you like Val Kilmer? Is Top Gun your favourite movie? Comment below. Love to hear your thoughts and your feedback. Love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. I'm Marianne Taylor, the House Detective, and I will see you next time. Or they were really ripped and had great abdominals. Not abdominals.